Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. Okay, today, folks, we are going to be talking about the most influential car of the 1920s. In the previous podcast that we've been doing, we've been choosing one car from each decade that cars have been in existence and analyzing it, why it's the most influential, what sorts of legacy it has left behind, what sorts of things that it did in its own day that were revolutionary, and things of that sort. So today, it is no different. We are going to be talking about the Dusenberg Model J, which was produced from 1928 until 1937. So even though most of these cars were produced in the 1930s, it is a product of the 1920s, which is why I decided to put it into this decade. So let's get started. As you all know, in segment 1, we're going to have the introduction to the car. In segment 2, we're going to have the specifications of the automobile, engine, length, body, things of that sort. In segment 3, we're going to be discussing some other cars that existed at the time period, as well as some history, just to give you a perspective as to what was going on in the world at the time. And then in segment 4, I will give you my own personal thoughts on this car, the time period, and other things that are relevant to our podcast that is at hand. So let's get started. Okay, so the Dusenberg was made by the same company that produced Auburn and Cord at the time. Auburn and Cord were other American automobile makers. Auburn is known for cars like the Auburn Boat-Tail Speedster, which is largely regarded as the first American sports car, and then Cord was known as being the first American car company to have front-wheel drive cars, and I believe the first car company in general to have pop-up headlights. So these are certain things that ought to not go unnoticed when we're talking about the Dusenberg Model J. It comes from a family of well-known cars of this time period. So it was produced from 1928 to 1937. And the Dusenberg Model J was intended to compete against the most luxurious and powerful cars of the age, such cars as Rolls-Royce and Hispano Suiza. So let's just put this into perspective. If we are going to be taking what a Dusenberg Model J was at the time and comparing it to what it would be today, we're talking about a car that's like a Bentley Continental GT. Very fast, very luxurious, built with the finest materials, with luxury and quality in mind. This is basically what the Dusenberg Model J was. These cars were not your average automobiles. They could not be afforded by the average person. The cost of one of these cars could be 3, 4, 5 times what the average worker made in America at the time. So this was something that was exorbitantly expensive, exorbitantly luxurious, and fast, and just taking everything from the time period and multiplying it by 10. This is what the Dusenberg Model J was. It was not the people's car like the Ford Model T. Much of the Model J's history would happen in the 1930s due to its late introduction and the stock market crash of 1929. So let's just couple that with the fact that this car is a very expensive car, and the fact that the Great Depression is right around the corner. Car was introduced in 1928, 1929, the stock market would crash, thus ushering in the Great Depression. That was a time of unmatched poverty in America and around the world. I mean, the Dust Bowl, caused, farmers not be able to farm their land because the land turned to dust. I mean, it was ridiculous. It was ridiculous. Now imagine the fact that Dusenberg is making these cars during this time period. And in segment 2, when we discuss specifications, you will find out how much money these cars cost in today's dollars. And this car, this idea, as influential as it was not sustainable, especially not at the time that it was introduced and being produced. There was no way for it to be sustainable. The world was not ready for this level of excess to exist while people in the same country were dying of starvation, were dying because of dust pneumonia, because of the Dust Bowl and the dust storms that were happening in a time of misery, sackcloth, ashes, gnashing of teeth, weeping, just biblical proportions of misery were befalling the American people and so many other countries around the globe. This was not a car that needed to be produced at this time period. So just to preface this, the Dusenberg Model J, it wasn't doomed. It's not like it was as a failure. It's just, as influential as it was, this should not have been a car that was being produced during the late 1920s into the 1930s. It wasn't something that was socially in tune with what was going on. But nonetheless, the car still existed, and we decided to do this podcast on it. So moving on. This car would be likened to, sort of like a supercar in today's standards. I said Bentley earlier, but think of it as not just a Bentley. Think of it as a supercar, because this car, the engine was massive. Not to say that other cars didn't have massive engines at the time, but the amount of power, the amount of torque, the amount of performance this car had, being able to crack 100 miles per hour. In 1920, 100 miles per hour was like 200 miles per hour is today. Most cars couldn't do that. We're talking about cars, the average car was like the Ford Model T, top speed 45 miles per hour, maybe 60 miles per hour. As engines got more advanced and, power was being more readily available to the common person. And they talk about horsepower. I mean, a horsepower of a car of that age, probably 40 to 80 horsepower, depending on the car that you had, which was sufficient for the cars of the time period. This car, you will soon find out, had over 200 horsepower in stock, naturally aspirated condition. I mean, this was insane. This was insanity, I should say. This was insane. I mean, these cars, for all intents and purposes, should not have existed, but yet they did. They found a way to exist and to carve their mark into the automotive book of history. I mean, these cars, amongst, collectors, are extremely valuable. Not only are they extremely valuable, they're extremely rare, and they're sought after. And these are able to keep up with modern traffic. This was a very modern interpretation of the car. It did a bit of everything. It was fast. It was luxurious. It was practical. I mean, as practical as a car that expensive could possibly be. But these were, I would say, from my own estimation, the first American supercar. I mean, it sounds crazy that I would be, ascribing the label supercar to a car produced in the 1920s. But when you think of the car's performance, how much the car cost, some of the technological advances, this car introduced, compared to your average car of its vintage, this car was truly something extraordinary. As the people of the time period would say, this was the bee's knees. I mean, this was the cat's pajamas. I mean, this was something that could not be replicated. This was something that America had never seen before, the world had not seen before, was a car like the Dusenberg Model J. the power, the speed, the luxury. This was something that was not comprehensible. Think of how, people would have thought of the Bugatti Veyron when it was introduced, 10, 15 years ago. I think it was 2008, the Bugatti Veyron was introduced. Think of the buzz that created. It had a W16 engine, fastest production car ever made at the time period, cost $1 million something. I mean, this is how the Dusenberg Model J would have been regarded at that time period. It would have been, some kid's pipe dream, like something of legend, like something that the average person would never even live to see. I have only seen a Bugatti Veyron once in my life. And this car has been around for nearly 15 years. I only saw one once. This is the exact exclusivity of the Dusenberg Model J. Think of it as a Bugatti Veyron. Nobody had the money to afford something like this. Nobody, not enough were made for it to be a common sight. And even if enough were made, not enough people made that much money to buy them. This was something that was super exclusive, super luxurious, and something that is not only the stuff of legend, something that was regarded as maybe even perhaps a tad bit wasteful. But it was the culmination of everything in the 1920s into one car. You imagine this. It's the end of World War I. Prosperity is, booming in the Allied countries. I mean, America's economy is through the roof. I mean, jazz and speakeasies and the prohibition was in full swing. I mean, you'll learn more about this in segment 3 when I discuss the history of the time period. But these were things that were excessive. They were things that were modern. They were things that, the world had not seen before. It would only make sense that a car like the Dusenberg Model J would come out of this time period. This was, have you seen the musical Thoroughly Modern Millie? Everything today is thoroughly modern. Like, cars are getting jazzier. Like, the term, it's a doozy, came from the Dusenberg. These cars were I can't stress enough how insane it was. It was exactly what would come out of the 1920s. Think of it. People are making money. The world is rejoicing after the end of the Great War, as they called it at the time period, because of course nobody would have called that World War I because they didn't know World War II was coming. So this was the time period in which things like this could exist. Cars like this, they could take a chance and make something like this. In times before, I mean, people were still getting around on horses and buggies. I had said that, the 1910s, the decade before the 1920s, was the last nail in the coffin of the horse and buggy. Nowadays, nowadays, speaking of the 1920s, people were able to afford cars, especially with the advent of the Ford Model T and, some of its competitors, making affordable cars for the general public. And not only that, there were so many other things that would have contributed to this sort of excess that Americans enjoyed during the 1920s. The same thing happened after World War II. It ended in 1945. The 1950s, a time of excess, a time of money, a time of prosperity, and this reflected itself in the cars of the 1950s. So it would only make sense that the prosperity of the 20s would give birth to something like the Dusenberg Model J. It's a no-brainer. It's just in our modern minds, we find it hard to believe that something like this could have existed at such a time period. We tend to think of, the 1920s, must have been primitive. That was 100 years ago. But no, not so. I mean, the Dusenberg Model J was anything but primitive for the time period. And heck, even by today's standards, it would hold its own against some modern cars, especially when you learn more about the specifications here in a couple of minutes. The Dusenberg Model J was a legitimate automobile, with a legitimate market for it, even though it was insane. even though it was absolutely positively insane, there were cars that existed at this time period that could give it a run for its money. Rolls-Royce, for example, the last segment or the last podcast that we had done was on the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, which was the most influential car of the 1910s, I could put it that way. The car had 40 to 50 horsepower in a time where cars were making 10 horsepower, and that was deemed sufficient. This is basically the spiritual successor to that. And Rolls-Royce would give, Dusenberg a run for its money as well. And Hispano-Suiza was also making cars of this ilk that could, take on these things. This was the time before, Mercedes-Benz had gotten really, really big. This was actually the time before Mercedes-Benz, because it wasn't known as Mercedes-Benz until late 1920s. This was a time before BMW had gotten big. This was a time before Audi. This was the time even before Cadillac had done anything crazy. I mean, these were the times before many of the big name brands in the car world were producing automotive juggernauts. It was Dusenberg back in the day. People didn't, strive to own a Mercedes-Benz S-Class. No, they strove to own a Dusenberg. The people didn't strive to own a Bentley Continental. They strived to, own a Dusenberg. I mean, this was the culmination of everything. Everybody who had good taste in cars, what they wanted was a Dusenberg. But anyway, moving on, we'll discuss the specifications and other things in segment 2. So please stay tuned after the break.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Okay, welcome back, car people. So in segment 1, I introduced you to the Dusenberg Model J and how absolutely crazy and ridiculous it was. So in segment 2, we are going to be talking about the specifications of this car. Not only the car, the body, the engine, the chassis, everything that went into it. We're going to be talking about the specifications. Now, mind you, this car was very advanced for its time period, and you will soon see what I'm talking about. It had a straight 8 engine. So you can imagine how massive this car had to be to accommodate a straight 8 engine. Because today, the straight 8 engine doesn't exist anymore. It's been largely replaced by the V8. Because the straight 8, when you have 8 cylinders in a single line, the engine block has to be really long. And with the design of modern cars nowadays, there wouldn't be a car that would be able to accommodate such a large engine, whether it be mounted in the middle of the car, in the rear, or in the front under a traditional hood, as we all know. This is not an engine that exists anymore. But at the time period, a straight 8 engine was a very viable option, especially when you're trying to get a lot of power, because straight engines are inherently more balanced than V engines, so they were simpler to produce and simpler to maintain. And get this, it had a displacement of 6.9 liters. 6.9 liters, it's absolutely massive. You think a big engine to us nowadays would be like, 5.0 in a Mustang. That's a 5-liter engine. That's a pretty big engine. Heck, even like some 6.2 liter engines, like the one found in the Nissan Armada was 6.2 liters, I believe. 5.7 liter engines, like the engines of the 90s that they put in the GMB body cars. No, this car was about 7 liters. 7 liters of displacement. in a straight 8 engine. Absolutely massive, of biblical proportions, if I could say that concerning a car. It had dual overhead camshafts, 4 valves per cylinder. I did not even know dual overhead camshafts were a technology that was even available in the 1920s. My Cadillac DeVille with the North Star engine had dual overhead camshafts. My Buick Park Avenue with the supercharged 3800 engine, not only does it not have dual overhead camshafts, even as it was supercharged, makes considerably less power than this car. And this car was, engineered about 70 years before my car was engineered. My car was engineered about 20 years ago. This car was light years ahead of its time as far as performance numbers go. This is something that you would expect to see coming from a car, out of the 1990s. Maybe even early 2000s. This is not something you expect to see from a car in the 1920s, late 20s, early 30s. But moving on. This is the 1928 to 1929 versions produced 265 horsepower, more than many modern cars. 265 horsepower is more than the 240 horsepower my supercharged Buick V6 makes. It's more than almost every single economy car you can think of. And it's on par with many sports cars of the 90s and of the 80s that are not too old by comparison to modern cars. I mean, this is something that was absolutely insane. And get this, the top speed was about 119 miles per hour. My car doesn't even go 119 miles per hour. My car is electronically limited from the factory to 112 miles per hour. It has a theoretical top speed of 147, but unless you remove the speed governor, it would never make that. This was the days before its speed governors. This car would top out at 119 miles per hour. We're talking about a car that was introduced in 1928. 1928. That was, oh my goodness, that was 93 years ago. The Dusenberg Model J was introduced 93 years ago, and at 93 years old, these cars are still producing 265 horsepower, top speed 119 miles per hour. And get this, after 1932, they were offered with a supercharger. I did not even know supercharging technology existed back in those days. Yet the Dusenberg Model J had it. But let's move on. This is still not the craziest thing about the car yet. As was common with many luxury cars of the day, the body was custom built and mounted onto a chassis that was sold from the factory. So get this. Imagine buying a car that's just a frame, and then you have to have a custom body commissioned for the car from a number of coach builders. That's how cars were done back then. Well, at least the top of the line, absolutely positively ultra luxury cars. That's what they were done back then. That's how they were, dealt with. That's how they were sold. You bought the chassis, and then you had a body that was mounted onto it, a body of your liking, of your specifications, of your choosing. So therefore, just like I had said with the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost of the 1910s, the Dusenberg Model J, no two Dusenbergs are the same. As a result, because each person who bought one, or I shouldn't even say bought. Bought is such a plebeian term. I should say each person who had one commissioned had a chassis and then a custom body from a number of coach builders, make a body to their specifications and mount it onto it. That's how crazy these cars were. That's how exclusive they were. You could not be an average person and own this car. That was just not a thing. An average person could not own this car. But anyway, moving on. So the cost. I want to spend special attention focusing on the cost of these cars. So a chassis in 1928 dollars cost $8,500. Do you know how much $8,500 is in 2020 dollars? That is $128,455.43. This car, imagine buying a car and just the frame costs $128,455.43. Just the frame, not something that you can even drive. This is just the frame that costs over $100,000. Do you know what you can get for $128,000? My goodness, you can get something like a Mercedes-Benz S65 AMG. You could probably get a G-Wagon for that money. I mean, heck, there are so many cars you can get for over $100,000. We're talking about like Aston Martin territory. We're talking about like, just insane cars like Audi R8s. These are cars that cost $100,000 something. And this was the frame alone that cost this much. Now imagine the completed cars were $13,000 to $19,000 in 1928 dollars. So in today's money, that is a completed car would be anywhere from $196,461.24 to $287,135.66. So now we're getting into Ferrari and Lamborghini territory with a completed car. And get this, some cost as much as $25,000 in 1928 dollars, which is $377,810.08. Now we're getting into Rolls-Royce and Bentley territory over here. This is something, the amounts of money something like this cost would have been dizzying to someone of the time period. Heck, it's dizzying to someone of today. How many times do you go out in your average place and you see a car that costs $377,000, almost $378,000? Heck, I live in Southwest Florida. I frequent places like Naples, downtown Fort Myers, downtown Cape Coral, things of that sort, where there are some wealthy people. But heck, I don't know if I ever see a car that's worth almost $400,000. I mean, you see a couple of Rolls Royces, but it's rare that you see a Rolls Royce Phantom that's over $400,000. Usually you see Rolls Royce Ghosts that are $280,000 to $300,000. This car is about $70,000 to $80,000 more expensive in its most expensive form, and right about on par with its average form. And get this, this was also before they started supercharging them in the 1930s. These cars were absolutely insane. That's the word I have to use to describe the Dusenberg Model J, is insanity. You'll hear me say over and over and over again, this was not normal. This was not normal. This was not something that was seen on a regular, everyday basis. These cars, like a straight 8 engine. Dual overhead camshafts. And get this, there was so much torque in these transmissions, in these motors, that you could hit 94 miles per hour in second gear alone. That's how much torque this car had. You should watch Jay Leno's Garage on similar cars of the time period, like the Bentley 8-liter that came out in the 1930s. And I believe he has one of the Dusenberg Model J too. I think his is a dual cowl Phaeton. This was a car that was imposing in every sense of the term. This is a car that, you walked up to something like this and made you fear for your life. I mean, this was not your average car. This was not your average car. I mean, you saw something like this. It was once said that the only car that could pass a Dusenberg was another Dusenberg, and that was if the first owner consented to being passed. That's how powerful these cars were. Nobody. These cars would outrun police. These cars would outrun anybody who was driving on the road. This was not something that was just your regular everyday automobile. Get this. A Model SSJ. Now, there were several models of the Dusenberg. There was the Dusenberg Model J. That was the naturally aspirated version. There was the Model SJ that came out in 1932 when they started supercharging them. So SJ was like supercharged J. And then there was the SSJ. That was a short wheelbase supercharged J. There was one of those, a Model SSJ, that sold in 2018 at auction for $22 million. It was the most expensive American car ever sold. Now, I had seen Shelby Cobras go for around $5, $6, $7 million on Mecum auto auctions. I have never seen a car, an American car, go for $22 million. That's how much those cars are worth. $22 million. Are you not 22,000? $22 million in 2018 money, which was just 3 years ago. A Dusenberg Model SSJ, I believe one of only two made. Dusenbergs were mind-blowing automobiles. Able to keep up in today's traffic. Jay Leno drives his on the highway. These cars are almost 100 years old, able to keep. I sat in one of these at the Tallahassee Automobile Museum. Of course, the owner doesn't know that I sat inside of it. The woman who was there at the time period, liked us so much because I walked into the place. And the first three cars that were on display were a Duesenberg, Accord, and an Auburn, and I named them right off the bat. She was very impressed. So she said, she trusted my friend Alana and I. She allowed us to sit in some of the cars. I sat inside of this Dusenberg Model J dual cowl Phaeton. I believe that was a 1930s model. This car, it was imposing. It was huge. It was tall. The wheels were big. The side-mounted spare tires were humongous. The hood alone could have been 7 feet long. I mean, this is not an exaggeration. This car was a lot of money. It was a lot of power. It was a lot of car for what you were paying. Granted, you were paying a lot, but even by today's standards, it's still a lot of car for what you're getting. I mean, it was something extraordinary. Something extraordinary and somewhat of a lost art too. Because after this Dusenberg Model J, there wouldn't be many ultra luxurious American supercars, if I could put it that way. I mean, that was a lost art. I believe after the 1930s, it kind of scared automakers away from doing things like that. But please stay tuned for segment 3, in which we're going to be discussing some of the history of the time period and some of the other cars that were also influential at this time period as well. So please stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
So welcome back, car people. Here we are in segment 3. In segment, not in December. In segment 1, we discussed the introduction of the goodness, I can't speak. The Dusenberg Model J. And then in segment 2, we discussed some of the absolutely insane, like I said, insane is the word I'm going to be using to describe this car. The insane specifications and proportions and amounts of money that people would spend on these cars. And now in segment 3, we're going to be discussing some of the other cars that existed at the time period and some of the history that was going on in the world. So in segment 3, we have some cars such as the Auburn Speedster. I had mentioned the Auburn Speedster as being produced by the same company as the Dusenberg Model J. The Auburn Speedster was largely regarded as the first American sports car. It was introduced in 1925, so right in the middle of this decade that we're discussing. Then there was the Chevrolet Series AA Capital. This was the chief competitor to the Ford Model A. Chevrolet didn't start producing cars until I believe the mid-1910s or something like that, but they had rapidly gained success, and this car, this Series AA Capital, was the chief competitor to the Ford Model A, because right around, if you remember the podcast on the Ford Model T, right around this time period, the Ford Model T had gone out of production and the Ford Model A had come to succeed it. And the reason why Ford didn't go from Model T to Model U, which would be the next letter in the alphabet, the reason why he went to Model A is because from his perspective, in his mind, the Ford Model A or the Ford Model T was such a revolutionary car that, a successor model wouldn't be able to justify it. So he had to restart, because it signified a start fresh for his company after the Ford Model T had gone out of production. So he started again with Ford Model A, and then in a few years they would move away from alphanumeric numbers, and they would move to more to actual names, like almost all of the Ford cars today have. And then there was some other car business going on in the time period, not necessarily specific cars, but Chrysler was founded by Walter P. Chrysler in 1925. The headquarters are the Chrysler Building in New York. And steam cars were still being produced by some notable companies such as White, Doble, and Stanley Steamer. Now, I found this to be rather interesting, and I truly believe that the 1920s are probably going to be the last decade we're going to be seeing any commercially viable steam cars being produced. Because the thing is with steam cars, steam technology, and maybe I should do a podcast on steam cars much later on in the future after this series is over, but steam cars were generally cleaner as far as burning, their fuel, because all that came off was water vapor. And steam cars were generally faster and generally more reliable than gasoline cars. But steam had its limits. Steam had its limits in the sense that it was limited in what, in for example, the range of a car. It was limited in how long it would take for you to start the car. Starting times could be as much as 30 minutes because you had to wait for the water to all boil and then turn into steam. And then there was different procedures because your steam engine is an external combustion engine, which the fuel is burnt outside of the engine, and then the product is delivered into the engine. So it wasn't as convenient as a gas car. Of course, some of the first White House automobiles were White steamers, I believe. White steamers were some of the most successful steam cars on the market at the time period. The first White House cars were steam cars. Steam was clean, steam was fast, steam was reliable, and steam engines were very powerful, and the technology was very familiar to people of the day. But steam had its limitations, and I believe those limitations would be made very evident by the time the 1920s had rolled around, when you had cars like the one we have been discussing, the Dusenberg Model J, that off of a gasoline engine could produce 265 horsepower with top speed of 119 miles per hour, and could, gasoline was clearly the superior form of the car. There were electric cars, there were steam cars, there were gasoline cars. Gasoline had the best of everything. Steam was powerful, steam was clean, but steam was a bit technologically behind. And electricity was probably the cleanest and the most reliable, but electricity couldn't go very far. So, gas had everything combined. A gas engine, if built properly, could be very reliable and gas was readily available. Gas was cheap, and depending on how much gas your car could hold and what the fuel mileage was, it could double, even triple the range of an electric car. I mean, so steam and electricity were falling by the wayside as far as commercially viable cars went. Nowadays, you can find electric cars, but this is after years and years and years of innovation and advancements in technology that make them a viable source of transportation today. This was not always the case for electrical cars. And so, yeah, steam cars had gone by the wayside by the end of the 1920s. Into the 1930s, if you had steam cars, there were a few holdouts left, but steam would not see a resurgence at all, unlike the electric car. The electric car would see a resurgence in the 2000s, but not steam. Steam was pretty much dead and gone by the time the end of the 1920s came about. Some history that was happening during this time period. Prohibition was in full swing in the 1920s. A bit of background about Prohibition. Basically, it was started by a very conservative group of women. Several women across the country were complaining that alcohol was legal, and the way that this had come about, that alcohol should be illegal, is because alcoholism was a very prominent thing, especially amongst male members of society at the time period. Well, in those days, women were regarded to stay at home and take care of children, to cook and clean and take care of the household. Men were expected to go out and work. Well, a lot of time, men who had gone out and worked would go and get drunk at bars and come home and beat their wives and children. So women who are sick and tired of men beating them, which is completely understandable, had, marched for prohibition to be a thing, for alcohol to be outlawed in the country. And by something that is, completely unheard of in today's world, alcohol was made illegal. Alcohol was made illegal, and this spawned, a huge network of underground alcohol producers known as bootleggers. And bootleggers would make alcohol, and they would make moonshine. Moonshine was alcohol made from corn that didn't need to be fermented, I guess. It was something along those lines, that it could be made from boiled corn mash. Basically, the alcohol was really pure, really strong, and very easy and fast to make, and could be made under, the cover of the moon at night, under the cover of darkness, by the moonlight. Hence why it is called moonshine. And even in today, in some parts of the deep south, you can find moonshine stills in the wilderness that haven't been used for 90-something years, that had been in effect since Prohibition. And so the Prohibition had become a thing. And a lot of times, people during Prohibition obviously didn't adhere to the rules. They drank wine. They drank other sorts of alcohol behind closed doors in little bars called speakeasies. And in order for you to gain access to a speakeasy, you had to know the password. And of course, speakeasies were frequently raided by Prohibition police, and then the alcohol was dumped out, and then only for them to find a new place to meet with a new alcohol supplier. And this I'm all telling you this to tell you that this even had an impact on car culture, because of the time period, cars weren't as extremely powerful. Like I said, the Dusenberg Model J was the exception. It wasn't the rule for how powerful cars were. Well, what bootleggers would do, they would take their cars, especially at this time period, the Ford V8 had become a thing. So they had taken, these cars, they would modify them, make them faster, and make their suspensions stiffer so that they would be able to accommodate the weight of alcohol being transported, and they would be able to outrun the police. So these cars were modified in such a way that they could outrun the police, and they could haul, respectable amounts of alcohol to whoever they were selling it to behind closed doors, so that the police would not catch them. And thus was the beginning of NASCAR racing, because NASCAR racing, after Prohibition had ended, they had a bunch of these souped up performance cars, so they would race them. NASCAR racing has its roots in Prohibition, which I thought was extremely poignant, or not necessarily poignant, was extremely important for me to to mention in this history section of this podcast. And this decade called the 1920s would actually go about by several names. It was called the Roaring Twenties, which is the one that we use the most often. In French-speaking cultures, it's called Année Folle, which means which is French for the crazy years. And it was also called the Jazz Age because of the popularity of swing music and jazz, hot jazz, things of that sort, things that would be playing in the speakeasy. I mean, this was a romantic time of America. This was the golden age of Hollywood. This was the Jazz Age. This was the time where, cars were becoming snazzy, like the Dusenbergs and the Cadillacs and Lincolns and Cords and other sorts of expensive cars. This was the time where movie stars were becoming popular. Television was or films were being produced, at rates that had not before been seen. I mean, this was the time period that has been so romanticized in American culture, was the 1920s, and dare I say it was one of America's best decades, followed by one of America's worst decades, the 1930s. But this was a time to be alive during the 1920s. This was prosperous. There was money flowing. There were cars. There was movies. There was alcohol, even though alcohol had been outlawed. This was a time that I feel like every person longs for. The amount of excess and the amount of glitz and glam that came from the 1920s. This is something that everyone secretly longs for, and I long for it too. It's a romantic time. It was a romantic time, and that was the culture that produced cars as excessive as the Cadillac Z16, the cars such as the Dusenberg Model J that we're discussing, cars over in England that produced the Bentley 8-liter that would come out at the end of the 1920s into the 1930s. This was this excess. It was this excess that produced such things. This was the time that women gained the right to vote in 1920. The Irish won their independence from Great Britain in 1922, and the USSR was also formed in that same year. So this was a time of big worldly changes that affect the world today. I mean, prohibition still has effects on American culture today. In Tennessee, for example, there are certain counties that you cannot buy alcohol on Sundays. And, there are just so many things that this time period had an effect on us today. And it's not just about cars. It's about the culture in general. American culture was booming during this time period. This was a great time for Americanness, American excess to really, take a root and grab hold and, bear fruits of excess for future generations to come. It started in the 1920s. But anyway, moving on, we're going to be discussing my thoughts in segment 4, so please stay tuned after the break.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
All right, welcome back, car people. So in segment 3, you heard me discuss some of the other history that was going on and some of the other cars that were being produced during this time period. So we have finally reached segment 4, which is towards the end of our podcast. So here are my thoughts on the Dusenberg Model J. This is probably one of the most special American cars ever made. I had known about Dusenberg for quite some time. For my whole entire life, I'd been a car geek. There was this website called hubcapcafe.com, in which it was like an online car show, in which, you know, people who had gone to car shows would take pictures of antique cars, classic cars, other sorts of things of that sort that they had found, and they would upload these pictures online with a brief description of the car. And I went through the entirety of this website several times in grade school, and I remember hearing about Dusenbergs. I had known about Dusenbergs probably since the time I was in 4th grade. And I had known that they were Dusenberg, Cord, and Auburn were all the same company. What I did not know, however, was how popular, or at least not how popular per se, but how legendary the Dusenberg Model J was. I had always known that Dusenbergs were huge cars, but I did not know that the Model J was the most famous of the Dusenbergs that had commanded such a presence. Not only such a presence, such a price tag. For this car to be almost $300,000 in today's money when it finally completed, after they bought a $100,000 chassis to have another couple $100,000 body to be fitted onto it. This is absolutely ridiculous. This is not things. These are not levels of excess that the country has seen in a while. For you to casually drop, $120,000 on a chassis, and then another $150,000 for a custom body to be mounted on said chassis, just so you could have a car. I mean, the most expensive American car today is probably the Ford GT, and the Ford GT is probably $400,000 to $500,000, maybe even $600,000. The next one after that is a far cry from the Ford GT as far as expensive American cars go. This was such a special American car in the minds of the American car enthusiasts. So special. And this was a very modern interpretation of the automobile as well. And let me put that into perspective. You know how nowadays, and this is something that I gripe and complain and moan about all the time, is that nowadays a car has to be everything. A car has to be luxurious. A car has to be sporty. A car has to be practical. It has to be this. It has to be that. It has to be all sorts of foolishness. Well, the Dusenberg Model J was that. It was that almost 100 years before cars had become that again. This car was fast, it was luxurious, and it was pretty practical as far as, cargo room and, passenger seating goes. This was a car that could not be mistaken for any other car during this time period. There was no other car that would be able to do what this car did in America at the time. Just like I had said, it was said that only a Dusenberg could pass another Dusenberg, and that was if the owner of the first Dusenberg consented to being passed in the first place. This was crazy. This was crazy. These were crazy cars. And this was a very modern interpretation of the car, like I had said earlier. This was the car that would set the tone for cars such as the Cadillac V16, the Bentley 8-liter, the heck, even some of the supercars that would come as a result, things like Lamborghini, even muscle cars. This is all performance cars. Performance cars. I mean, performance cars have a bit of the Dusenberg Model J DNA in them. This was one of the first true performance cars, because performance cars before this were racing cars that had been civilized for public use. This was a car that was, even though their engine was based off of a racing engine, this car was meant for the open road. This was not a car that was once a race car turned civilian car. This is a car that was a civilian car that could rival race cars, which is exactly what a supercar is. This was a supercar. For its time period, it was a supercar. This was crazy. And this is not something that America would pretty much ever see again. Something as large, luxurious, powerful and commanding as a Dusenberg, especially the Model J, which is the most famous of the Dusenbergs. This is something that, will go down in history as one of the most successful cars, or one of the most influential cars, and really one of the most successful cars ever made. This is something that is something else, nothing like it. This I must lament, represents a lost art of ultra luxury American cars. Packard, after Dusenberg, would go the way of the dodo. Packard, was of the time period, also very luxurious, very large American cars. But the thing about Packard was, Packards weren't sport-oriented cars. These cars were not fast. These cars were not like Bentleys. Packard was very much more like Rolls-Royce, in which, performance wasn't their main priority. It was luxury, it was build quality. Cadillac would have things like the Eldorado. But Packard was really the last of the American ultra-luxury brands that didn't have cost-cutting or anything of that sort. Packard didn't start cost-cutting until he was almost out of business, and when they merged with Studebaker, I believe, during the 1950s. And after that, in which Packard would soon go out of business, and Studebaker would also shut its doors as well. We think of Cadillac as being, some of the most expensive cars ever made in America, whereas that is true. But there were cars that a Cadillac couldn't hold a candle to. These cars were things like the Dusenberg. Cadillac couldn't hold a candle to Dusenberg of the time period. Yeah, Cadillac may have had a V16 engine at some point, but this was nothing. This was nothing compared to the Dusenberg Model J. Cadillac's V16 engine produced like 120 horsepower, which granted was a lot for the time period, but this car produced double that and more out of just 8 liters, half the size, or out of just 8 cylinders, half the size of a V16. This is something that was way ahead of its time, that people likely would have had trouble understanding. What are the implications of 265 horsepower? My Buick Park Avenue has 240 horsepower. I mentioned that over and over and over again, but I have to drive home the point for emphasis. The Dusenberg Model J was a car that will never be seen again on American roads. Yeah, you had the Ford GT, but the Ford GT is a sports car. It's an exotic car. It's a supercar. It's not a luxury car. You don't have luxury cars that have this sort of performance here in America, and that have this sort of price tag. Yeah, the Cadillac V series, like the CTS-V or the CT6-V or whatever the V cars are nowadays. But these are cars that, these are cars that compete against German cars. These are not cars that the Germans long to become like. These are the cars that, because Germans have always been more successful at selling selling luxury cars, the Americans are trying to copy the Germans through, V series of their, Cadillacs. This was not something that was, these are not something that were designed from the ground up to make the Germans shake in their boots, as far as performance cars go. If Dusenberg had still been around, I doubt it that Americans would flock to Mercedes-Benz and BMW for a luxury brand. If they were tired of Cadillac, they would have flocked to Dusenberg. If only Dusenberg were still around. This is something crazy. I remember, on my road trip, I took a road trip back in 2019 from Tampa all the way to Stamford, Connecticut. I had done 13 states and D.C. in 13 days, 2 different time zones, 4,306 miles overall. Well, on the second or third day, it was the third day of my trip, the day that I would be going to Savannah, Georgia. Actually, this was the second day of my trip, the day before I'd be going to Savannah, Georgia. I had paid a visit with my friend Alana to the Tallahassee Automobile Museum. And then, like I had said in the previous segment, I'm going to expound on this story a little bit. I had walked into the door with Alana, and then I had seen, Auburn, Dusenberg, and Cord right out, the first 3 cars as soon as you walk in through the doors. The first one was a Dusenberg Model J. The second one was, I believe, an Auburn. And the third one was a Cord. And I known right off the bat, especially when I saw the Cord with that iconic coffin nose and those pop-up headlights, I had known that it was a Cord right away. And I had seen Cord, I had seen Auburn, and I had seen Dusenberg. And the logical progression just came to my mind. Cord, Auburn, and Dusenberg. It's exactly what I said as soon as I walked through the doors. Now, the woman, her name was Cherie. Cherie was very surprised because I'm a young guy. At this time, oh dear, I was 21 years old. At this time, I was 21, and Cherie was just amazed by my knowledge of the cars as soon as I walked in. And she said, how do you know that? She's like, oh, I know cars. And then she takes me to the 1953 Cadillac Eldorado, and she undoes the rope and lets me go touch the car. And she's like, show me where the gas tank is on something like this. So obviously I go to the tail light and I press the button and I flip it up. I was like, that's how you fill up the gas. And she's like, wow, how do you know? And I was like, I know cars. Well, towards the end, I mean, the museum was going to close, soon that day anyway. And there were some friends of the owners that had come by and stopped by to see the cars, but the museum was pretty much empty. The owner wasn't there. And then Cherie and I, along with Alana, we were the only 3 people in the museum at the time. So she told us that we were welcome to touch the cars, to hop inside of them if we felt like it, because she trusted us. She knew that we wouldn't do anything bad to the cars if we wanted to take pictures. So we saw some of these cars, but we just had to go to the Dusenberg Model J. This thing was captivating. Just tons and tons of chrome. It was long. This was a dual cowl Phaeton body. So you had 2 windshields. I mean, this was something out of my dream. I sat into it. I sank into the seat, and you could barely see past the long hood. I could only imagine going 120 miles per hour in a car like that. It was crazy. This was something like movie stars would buy. Something movie stars would be seen in driving. This was not something that me, little old David Lucy Mabel, would ever be caught sitting in. But there I was, sitting in this piece of automotive history. The first Dusenberg I'd ever seen in person. The first Dusenberg I'd even touched, let alone sat in. This was a car. This was a car. This wasn't some plastic bound together with zip ties. No. This was a car. In every truest sense of the term. This was a car in its realist fashion. Everything a car should be boiled down into a car. This was a Dusenberg Model J. Like, so many people are like, how about the Bentley 8-liter? How about the Mercedes this? How about the Mercedes that? How about the BMW? Those cars weren't American. This was an American car. And it's a shame that most Americans don't know what a Dusenberg is. They ought to know. This was the beginning of American performance cars. This was the beginning of any ultra-luxury car that would ever come out of America. It all started here with the Dusenberg Model J. They should know. It should be a source of American pride that we come from a country in which this car could be engineered at this time period. This, ladies and gentlemen, was something that nobody had ever witnessed before, was something like the Dusenberg Model J. So there you have it. There's the Dusenberg Model J. There's my very poignant story on it. And this is a podcast. Pardon me if I sound very quiet. I've been under the weather these past couple of days. I've had this terrible chest pain. But other than that, I had to do this podcast because this was something I was passionate about, even though it doesn't necessarily come out in my delivery. But this is the Dusenberg Model J. So please follow us on social media. We have an Instagram account now, which is why we're doing this series on the most influential cars of every decade. The Instagram account is up and running. We've got about 42 followers last time I checked. We're still needing some more people. So if you see this on Instagram, if you see this on Twitter, or if you follow us on, Apple Podcasts or things of that sort, please leave a like and a comment, rate our podcast, leave a comment, and tell us what you think is the most influential car of any decade. Because I would love some audience feedback, and you will most definitely get a shout out if I end up doing your recommendation anyway. So this has been the GSMC Car Podcast with David Lucy Mabel. Once again, we're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker, YouTube, and please like us on Instagram, and please, follow us on Twitter, things of that sort. Thank you so much, and have a good night, folks.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.